Well, it's been one of those weeks that we've had a lot of our church members in the hospital, and so we need to make sure we're praying for them, and a lot of stuff's going on. But the title of this message is, Whom is God Sending to You? And many times we have to realize that the Lord is at work around us. Some people like that. Some people don't like that. Many times there's people they would just rather the Lord not be at work around them and just let them be. But the thing is, we have to realize the Lord is at work around us. In Matthew chapter 17, one of the things that happened here in these two verses is kind of neat. In verse 17 of this, chapter 17, verses 16 and 17, I think many times verse 17 gets overlooked in this situation. Verse 16 of chapter 17 of Matthew, it says, "And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. And Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. Bring him here to me." One of the things I want you to notice here is Jesus gave his disciples the power to cast out demons. He had given them the ability to perform miracles and heal people. And one of the things we have to realize is in that same things, to do miracles, to touch people where they're in need, where they're hurting, where they're suffering. The Lord has blessed all his people in such a way that we are to be a blessing to them and to touch them. He gave them his authority to minister to the people. Yet because of their self-centered, and they lost the power of God to work. Now think about this. The disciples were given the power from God on high. And it was put inside of them to go out and to minister to the people. But what started happening? The disciples started wondering who was better than the other. They started looking at one another's circumstances. They started looking at all this stuff. And they took their eyes off of Christ and they started putting it on their circumstances and what they thought they wanted or what they desired, and they lost the power. When God sent a father with his epileptic son to them for healing, they failed miserably. Think about something. How many people will cross your path this week that was needing a touch or a word from Christ and you didn't do it? You was just the same as the disciples and failed miserably. Me, myself, there were times that people probably crossed my path this week that I failed miserably, just as the disciples did. They were so concerned with their possessions and their status, they lost their focus of what God wanted to do through them. You see, God wanted to do miracles through the disciples. And here come a man with his son that was sick and suffering. And the father wanted his little boy to be healed. But because the disciples were looking inward instead of looking outward, they could not be used by God. Jesus responds to his disciples. Now, this is the part that I was talking about in verse 17, I think gets overlooked. Jesus' response to the disciples included some very harsh words ever come from his mouth. To me, some of the harshest words that ever came from Jesus' mouth comes out of verse 17. He calls his own disciple faithless. Some versions of the Bible, he calls them unbelieving. And he called them a twisted generation. Some versions of the Bible, he called them perverse. Do you realize that if Jesus himself, and whom you were walking with, whom you were living with, right beside, whom you were doing ministry with, who you loved, who you knew loved you, and all of a sudden you were sent to do a task, you had failed at this task, and now he's looking you straight in the eye and he is calling you faithless. He's calling you an unbeliever. He's calling you a twisted generation. He's saying you are perverse because he's saying you have lost what the calling was that I put on your life. Jesus had got upset with them. And you can see it there in verse 17. The question, how long, he's asking them how much longer he can endure with them. Look at verse 17. I'm going to read it again. Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? Can you see the in between the lines there? He's frustrated. He's upset. He's ill. Next sentence, he says, again, how long am I to bear with you? Next part, bring him here to me. Jesus is like, how long is this going to keep happening? How long are y'all going to miss the boat? How long are y'all going to keep looking at yourselves instead of looking at what I'm trying to do through you? It's not about you. It's not about what you're going to get. It's not about what order you're in. He's about what I'm trying to do through you. And the disciples were getting it. In the last sentence of this verse 17, Jesus just goes, look, y'all don't get it. You're clueless. You're missing it. He says, just bring the boy here. Bring him here. And then when the boy was brought before Jesus, Jesus healed the little boy. You see, this could have been accomplished through the disciples, but the disciples missed it. They missed the opportunity to do something great in ministry. They missed it because they were so concerned about themselves. We say, why? Why about this? Because they were supposed to be on a mission with him. They were on missions. Now you say, Wes, we're not on missions. We're at home. We're at work. We're with our family. We're with this and that. No. When Jesus Christ comes and dwells in your heart, you become one of his children. You become on missions at that very moment. The disciples were on missions with Jesus to bring salvation to others. But were so disoriented to him, they had lost their spiritual power. They were so overwhelmed by all the things in which the Lord that was going on around. They started looking at all the stuff and they started allowing all this stuff to take their eyes off of that, and they lost their spiritual power. They lacked the faith to bring a completion to the mission. And dealing with spiritual and physical comfort to those who God had sent to them. Do you realize that God allowed and had this father bring this child to the disciples? Now think about this. Jesus was there in the town. Jesus was there in the area. And who did the father bring the child to? The disciples. Because, now think about this. Who is bringing the people across our path that we need to have the faith? We need to have the spiritual power and to touch them physically and spiritually in whatever need is going on. When we can't touch them and we don't touch that need that is happening in their life, we're failing just the same as the disciples failed. One of the other things that we should notice in these two verses is God ought to be able to send a hurting person to any child of his. Think about that. Any person that's hurting, if you are a child of God, he should be able to send someone across his children's paths and his children should be looking with his eyes, touching with his hands, and going with his feet, and speaking with his mouth the needs in which these people are having. Except they will be helped. They're expecting help from us, but are they getting it? Is our community getting help from Calvary Baptist Church? Is our family getting help from Calvary Baptist Church? Is our town getting help from Calvary Baptist Church? If not, we're missing the boat. We're falling short. Like the disciples, we can become so preoccupied with our own ambitions and distractions by the busyness of our lives that we become ineffective for Christ in ministering to those God sends to us. It is even possible to become so involved in religious activities that we are no help to anybody. You say, well, how is that? Because when we get so busy about activities or stuff and we're not focusing on Christ, we're doing it out of obligation. We're doing it out of routine. We're doing it out of this. We need to be serving and doing out of Christ. It needs to be Christ in us, coming through us and doing it. If we're trying to do it on our own ability, our own strength, and our own understanding, we're not going to get it accomplished. But Christ through us, it can be. And in closing, regardless, take an inventory of your life to see if you're being faithful stewards to every life God sends to you. Many times we hear the word steward, we think of money. I'm not talking about money. Are we being stewards with our lives in other people's lives the way Christ desires for us to? You see, the disciples missed the boat. They weren't being good stewards in this little boy's life. They weren't being good stewards to this father that brought a sick son to them to do a miracle. We are called to do miracles for Christ every day. They just all look different. Are you found faithful in doing the miracles for Christ? Let's pray. Father, I know every day, Lord,